Hey everyone, welcome back to Whyloric. Today we're talking about the Titanic, specifically why it was ever called unsinkable in the first place. And honestly, the real story is way more unsettling than you'd expect. Let's get into it.
If I ask you to name the one word,
Right.
the single word that is just intrinsically linked to the Titanic, I can guarantee you're going to say unsinkable.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's the defining concept of the entire tragedy.
Yeah, exactly. But what if I told you the company that actually built the ship never, ever printed that word on a single official advertisement?
It completely upends the traditional narrative we all grew up with.
It really does.
We hold on to this image of, arrogant shipbuilders tempting fate by slapping the word unsinkable across giant billboards.
Yeah.
But looking at the historical script we have in front of us, that's simply never happened.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a story you think you know inside and out, and we are going to strip away the pop culture lore.
Yeah, the cinematic romances, the dramatic soundtracks, all of that.
Right. Our mission today is to dig through the raw source material, to really separate the engineering facts from the myths, and to uncover the catastrophic impact of outdated safety rules.
Because when you look at the actual documentation, the reality of what happened is wild.
So wild.
And more importantly, the mechanisms behind why it happened are just far more complex than the simple, enduring narrative of a cursed ship.
Yeah, there's no curse here.
No, we are looking at a masterclass in how small, mundane failures align to create a massive disaster.
We really have to start with that hook, because I am still hung up on it.
Right.
If the White Star Line, the owners of the Titanic, if they didn't actually advertise the ship as unsinkable, who did?
Right. That's the big question.
Because it is a remarkably bold claim to attach to a massive metal object you were dropping into the middle of the freezing ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that word come from, if not from the people selling the tickets?
So to understand the disaster, you first have to understand the myth-making machine of that era.
Okay.
The origin of the word unsinkable actually came from a trade publication, a magazine called The Shipbuilder.
Wait, just a trade magazine?
Yeah, exactly. They were doing this highly technical profile on the engineering of the vessel, and in their assessment, they described the ship's design as practically unsinkable.
Okay, let's unpack this. Practically unsinkable.
Yes.
I feel like the word practically is doing a massive amount of heavy lifting in that sentence.
Oh, it's doing all the heavy lifting.
Because, to an engineer, that is a qualifier.
Ah.
That means under all reasonably expected parameters, known historic scenarios, this design should hold up.
Right. It is the ultimate qualifier. It's an acknowledgement of statistical probability, not an absolute guarantee of immortality.
Right.
But what's fascinating here is how the broader media ecosystem operates, particularly during the peak of the Industrial Revolution.
Well, people were obsessed with progress.
Exactly. The public was hungry for marvels. They wanted to be part of an era where humanity was actively conquering the elements, through steel and steam.
And the mainstream press doesn't deal well with nuance or engineering qualifiers.
They really don't. Practically Unsinkable is a clunky, hesitant headline. Unsinkable, well, that is a blockbuster.
So the public imagination just took this nuanced engineering assessment, stripped away the one word that grounded it in reality, and transformed it into a myth.
Yep. People wanted a technological fortress, so the newspapers gave them one.
But, okay, I have to push back on the White Star Line's innocence here.
Fair enough.
Like, if I build a car and a magazine says it can practically fly, and suddenly millions of people are buying it thinking it's literally an airplane, at some point, I have a moral obligation to step in.
Brett, you'd think so, yeah.
I'd have to say, hey, everyone, please keep this vehicle on the road. Weren't the builders essentially complicit by not correcting the public record?
That touches on a very modern concept of corporate responsibility, though.
I see.
By allowing the myth to propagate unchecked, the White Star Line benefited immensely from the free, sensationalized marketing.
Oh, I'm sure they loved it.
They didn't have to print posters saying unsinkable because the global echo chamber was doing the marketing for them.
So they just sat back and enjoyed the halo effect. The public is doing their PR and fleeting the majesty of their ship, and they just choose not to issue a correction.
Exactly. But the danger with that passive acceptance is that when you allow the press to inflate the capabilities of your own creation, it can subtly shift how you and your employees operate it.
The myth begins to infect the mindset of the operators.
Bingo. But it is crucial to recognize that the Shipbuilder magazine didn't pull this claim out of thin air just to sell copies.
No.
No, when they looked at the blueprints, there was a genuine structural reason they were so incredibly impressed.
Okay, yeah, I am looking at the source text regarding the hull design right now, and it outlines the internal structure. The lower hull was divided into 16 separate watertight compartments.
Right?
Now, to a layman like me, dividing a ship into 16 isolated zones sounds incredibly robust. Was this just the industry standard they were mimicking? Or was this the massive leap forward that had the trade magazines so hyped up?
Oh, it was a legitimate leap forward. Previous generations of ships were essentially large, hollow shells.
Like a bathtub.
Exactly like a bathtub. If a ship struck a rock and suffered a significant puncture, the water would just flood the entire internal cavity, dooming the vessel.
Right, because there's nothing to stop the water from rushing everywhere.
But the innovation here was containment. These 16 compartments were separated by massive steel walls called bulkheads.
Okay.
If the hull was breached, the crew could literally just throw a switch on the bridge, the heavy doors between the compartments would seal shut, and the flooding would be isolated to just that specific section.
So the math is entirely based on containment. You get a hole in one part of the ship, the water rushes in, you close the doors, and that single compartment just becomes a heavy water-filled box.
Precisely.
But the rest of the ship stays dry. And the script notes that the ship was mathematically calculated to handle flooding in 2 of those compartments, or even up to 4 compartments in a worst-case scenario at the front of the ship.
Yep, and it would still remain buoyant.
That's pretty impressive.
It was. The designers looked at the historical data of ship collisions. They calculated the typical size of hull breaches from, running aground or hitting another vessel.
And they built a system around that data.
Yeah, they built a system that mathematically exceeded the worst damage they had on record. It was a deeply confident, data-driven design.
Okay, so this is why the engineering community considered it practically unsinkable. The math actually backed it up.
The math totally backed it up.
But, and this is a massive but, the math was entirely reliant on historical data, right? And an iceberg is not a historical data point.
Not at all.
It is an unyielding act of nature. And this is a crucial distinction the text makes. The collision wasn't a single clean puncture. It wasn't like a spear poking a hole in the side of a boat.
No, the mechanics of the collision are fundamental to understanding the failure here. The ship didn't hit the iceberg head on.
It tried to turn, right?
Yeah, it tried to turn, and in doing so, it scraped along the side of the massive, jagged ice structure underwater.
Oh, wow.
The damage dragged along the hull for roughly 300 feet. It didn't breach 1 compartment or 2 or even the maximum 4.
Oh, no.
The scrape opened up a series of small slits across 5 of those watertight compartments.
5. Just 1 single compartment, more than the absolute maximum limit of their math.
Literally 1 compartment over the line.
But, okay, I am stuck on a mechanical detail here. I really need to unpack this.
Sure, go for it.
If these compartments are sealed and 5 of them get holes in them, why does the whole ship sink? I mean, if they are watertight, shouldn't they act like sealed Tupperware containers?
You would assume so.
Right. Why does water in the front 5 compartments doom the other 11? It seems like they should just be 5 heavy boxes at the front.
And that brings us to the fatal compromise in the design.
Okay, here we go.
The watertight bulkheads, those massive steel dividing walls we talked about,
Yeah.
they did not go all the way up to the top deck.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they were capped at E deck, which was only a few decks above the waterline. They were not sealed at the top like a Tupperware container.
Wait, hold on. Let me get this straight. You build a state-of-the-art containment system, but you leave the tom open.
Pretty much.
That defies basic logic. Why on earth wouldn't they run the steel walls all the way to the ceiling?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the primary purpose of the ship. It wasn't a military vessel built purely for survival.
No, it was a luxury liner.
Exactly. To run those massive steel walls all the way up through the upper decks would have completely ruined the architectural flow of the first-class spaces.
Oh, are you kidding me?
I'm completely serious.
Yeah.
You couldn't have the famous sweeping grand staircase. You couldn't have the cavernous, uninterrupted first-class dining rooms or the long, elegant promenades.
Ah, I see. So it was a direct conflict between engineering safety and luxury ticket sales.
Very much so.
They prioritized the aesthetic experience of the ultra-wealthy over actually sealing the containment system.
Yeah, they assumed that because the math said 4 compartments was the maximum possible damage, capping the walls at E deck was perfectly safe.
So they believed the water would never rise high enough inside the ship to ever reach the top of those bulkheads.
Exactly. But with 5 compartments exposed to the ocean, the buoyancy calculations completely collapsed. Millions of gallons of incredibly heavy ocean water rushed into the front of the ship.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize the physics of this.
It's actually pretty easy to picture if you break it down.
It's like taking a row of empty pint glasses and setting them in a larger tub of water so they float, right?
Okay, yeah.
If you poke a hole in the bottom of one glass, it fills up and sinks a bit lower, but the others are fine. But if you poke holes in the first 5 glasses in the row, the collective weight of the water in those front glasses is going to drag the entire front of the line down.
That is exactly the mechanism at play. As the front of the ship became heavier and heavier, the nose of the vessel began to pull downward.
So the ship actually tilted forward into the ocean.
Yes. And as it pitched forward, the water inside those front 5 compartments rose higher and higher until it reached E-deck, which, again, was the top of the dividing walls.
And because there is no lid on the Tupperware,
The water simply spilled over the top of the wall into the 6th compartment.
wow. The source material uses this really specific phrase for it, an ice cube tray effect.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, if you take a plastic ice cube tray and you run the tap into just the very first slot, once that slot is full, the water just crests over the little plastic divider and fills to the second slot.
Yep.
And it spills over and fills the third. It's so inevitable.
Once that forward tilt began, the watertight doors at the bottom of the ship were entirely irrelevant. The water was bypassing the doors by spilling over the tops of the walls.
That is terrifying.
It was a cascading failure. Compartment 6 filled, adding more weight, pulling the bow deeper, which caused the water to spill into compartment 7, pulling it even deeper.
So you have these passengers and crew who have been operating under the assumption that they are on a technological marvel.
Right, they feel perfectly safe.
They hear the heavy steel doors seal shut deep in the hull, which gives this powerful illusion of safety. But silently, right behind the walls, the water is just climbing the bulkheads and pouring over the top.
Fueled entirely by the fact that luxury demanded an uninterrupted dining room.
The engineering failed because the design compromised ultimate safety for aesthetics, relying on historical probabilities that were shattered by a freak 5-compartment scrape.
Exactly. And when the primary engineering system fails, you have to rely on your safety backups.
Which shifts the narrative from an engineering crisis to an evacuation crisis.
Right. And the numbers regarding the evacuation are just brutal to look at.
Yeah, let's lay out the facts from the script because this part is hard to process.
Okay, yeah.
The ship was carrying roughly 2,200 people on this voyage, right? Passengers and crew combined.
Yep.
But the total capacity of all the lifeboats on board was only enough to hold about 1,100 people.
A mathematical deficit of over 1,000 seats before the ship even left the dock in Southampton.
That is just insane. So if we run a thought experiment here,
Okay.
imagine it is broad daylight. The water is perfectly calm. There is zero panic. Everyone lines up in an orderly fashion. And the crew has like 10 hours to meticulously fill every single boat to its absolute maximum capacity.
A best case scenario.
Right. Even in that utopian evacuation scenario, half the people on that ship are undeniably doomed. They simply do not have a seat.
It's mathematically impossible to save them.
How is that legally possible? How does a government regulator look at a ship carrying 2,200 human beings, look at lifeboats for 1,100, and stamp approved on the paperwork?
This is where we uncover the devastating lag of bureaucratic rulemaking.
Bureaucracy.
Yeah, the safety regulations of that era, which were governed by the British Board of Trade, were drastically outdated. The rules dictating how many lifeboats a ship was required to carry were not based on the passenger count at all.
Wait, what were they based on?
They were based on the ship's tonnage.
Tonnage, you mean the physical weight or size of the ship itself. Why would a safety regulator care more about the size of the steel than the number of beating hearts on board? That makes zero sense.
Well, to understand the regulators, you have to look at the history of the maritime industry. When these laws were written decades earlier, the vast majority of ships on the ocean were cargo vessels.
Okay, yeah.
Tonnage is a measure of a ship's enclosed internal volume. Essentially, its cargo carrying capacity. In the late 19th century, passenger travel was just a smaller fraction of the industry.
So they didn't really account for thousands of people.
No, the Board of Trade built a formula based on tonnage because that was the standard metric for classifying ships at the time.
Okay, so the law essentially said, if a ship has this much internal volume, it needs to dedicate a certain fraction of that space to carrying lifeboats.
Yes.
But surely, as passenger travel exploded and ships became these massive floating hotels, someone at the Board of Trade realized the math was flawed, right?
You'd hope so, but bureaucracy runs on intense inertia.
Ain't that the truth?
The laws scaled up in brackets. But the Industrial Revolution accelerated shipbuilding capabilities far faster than the government updated its paperwork. The Board of Trade's regulations had a top bracket that maxed out at ships of 10,000 tons.
Wait, the law maxed out at 10,000 tons?
It did.
What was the tonnage of the Titanic?
Over 46,000 tons.
Oh my God. So what does this all mean? The government literally didn't have a legal bracket for a ship this size.
The law simply didn't comprehend a ship of that magnitude. The regulations stated that any ship of 10,000 tons or above required a minimum of 16 lifeboats.
And that's it, just 16.
That's it. The builders of the Titanic looked at the law, provided the 16 lifeboats required for that top bracket, and actually added 4 extra collapsible boats on top of that.
So in their minds, they weren't cutting corners at all.
Not at all.
They were actually exceeding the legal requirement by adding extra boats.
Exactly. From a strictly legal and administrative standpoint, the White Star Line considered their ethical obligations fulfilled. They provided more than the law demanded. The tragic reality is that the law itself was fundamentally broken. It was applying the safety standards of a 19th century mail ship to a 20th century floating city. Technological innovation had completely outpaced the speed of regulation.
It is the classic problem of the law moving at the speed of paper, while technology moves at the speed of steel.
That's a great way to put it.
You have regulators who are asleep at the wheel, designers who prioritize grand staircases over sealed bulkheads, and a public intoxicated by a media-generated myth.
It's the perfect storm.
All of these administrative and design failures set the stage perfectly. But a ship doesn't just spontaneously hit an iceberg because the paperwork is bad.
No, it doesn't.
It requires human operational decision-making to drive the vessel into a known hazard.
Right. Administrative failures build the environment for disaster, but the operational decisions on the bridge act as the trigger.
Exactly.
And the historical script highlights a glaring operational reality here. On the night of the sinking, the ship was moving at near top speed through an area where they had actively received radio warnings about ice.
See, this is the part that blows my mind. If I am driving down the highway and my GPS tells me there is a massive wreck ahead, I take my foot off the gas.
Obviously.
If other ships are radioing the Titanic saying, hey, we are surrounded by massive blocks of ice floating in your path, why on earth does the captain maintain high speed?
The source material provides 2 prevailing historical theories for this behavior, and both offer profound insights into the psychology of the era. The first theory centers heavily on reputation and hubris.
Hubris. I mean, this was the maiden voyage, right? The ultimate PR event. I imagine there was immense pressure from the corporate side.
Huge pressure. The ship was an astronomical financial investment. The global press was watching, and rival shipping lines were waiting for them to stumble.
So they needed to win.
They did. There was an intense desire to prove that this enormous, opulent vessel was not just luxurious, but reliable and fast. There's a strong historical argument that they were pushing the engines, hoping to arrive in New York ahead of schedule to generate spectacular headlines and cement their dominance.
So they were potentially risking thousands of lives for a good PR cycle.
Essentially, yeah.
It sounds incredibly cynical, prioritizing immediate glory over unseen risks. But the text mentions a second theory that, honestly, I find even more unsettling.
I agree. The second theory is chilling. It argues against the idea of intentional, villainous arrogance and instead points to complacency.
Complacency.
Yeah. It suggests that maintaining high speed through an ice field wasn't an act of reckless hubris, but simply standard operating practice for North Atlantic liners at the time.
Standard practice? You mean every captain was just barreling through ice fields at top speed?
Pretty much. The argument here is that the crew, despite being highly experienced veterans of the ocean, had been lulled into a false sense of security.
How does that happen?
Well, they had navigated these routes for years. They had received ice warnings on previous voyages, maintained their speed, and relied on the lookouts in the crow's nest to spot any danger in time to simply steer around it.
Oh, wow.
They didn't take the warnings as a mandate to slow down because the ocean had never punished them for ignoring those warnings before.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the concept of the normalization of deviance.
Exactly.
You do something slightly dangerous every single day, like speeding through a yellow light. You never get into a crash, so you start to believe the yellow light isn't actually dangerous.
That's a perfect analogy.
The crew wasn't trying to be reckless. They were just operating under business as usual because their past success blinded them to the statistical inevitability of a crash.
Yeah, when you synthesize all of these elements, it shifts how we must view the disaster. It wasn't one massive blunder. In the study of complex systems, this is known as the Swiss cheese model of disaster.
The Swiss cheese model. I love this concept.
Imagine several slices of Swiss cheese lined up in a row. Each slice represents a layer of defense.
Right. So the engineering is one slice. The safety regulations are another. The lookouts are a third.
Exactly. And in any real-world system, every slice has holes in it. Imperfections, blind spots, compromises. Usually, if a hazard passes through a hole in one slice, it is stopped by the solid part of the next slice. The system holds.
But on this specific night, in April 1912.
The holes in every single slice of cheese aligned perfectly.
Wow.
The public overconfidence allowed the crew to feel invincible. That complacency passed through the hole of the ice warnings. The decision to maintain high speed passed through the hole of the lookout's limited visibility on a moonless night.
It's just one thing after another.
It really is. The 300-foot scrape passed through the hole of the 5-compartment design limit and the E-deck bulkheads. And finally, the need for evacuation passed through the massive, gaping hole of the outdated, tonnage-based lifeboat regulations. A clear trajectory straight through all the defenses.
When you lay it out like that, it completely reframes the tragedy.
It does, doesn't it?
Hearing the story growing up, people use words like cursed or fated. It feels mythical. But realizing that a disaster of this unimaginable scale was caused by mundane bureaucratic inertia, architectural vanity, and standard operational complacency, that is significantly scarier than a curse.
A curse implies that the event was entirely out of human control.
Exactly.
The Swiss cheese model proves that the disaster was entirely preventable. It was a failure of human foresight and systemic design. Reality is always much colder and more unforgiving than the myths we create to comfort ourselves.
And when a systemic failure results in a tragedy that shakes the globe, it forces a reckoning. A disaster of this magnitude doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No, it acts as a massive catalyst.
When the sun comes up and the world realizes what happened, how does the maritime industry even begin to justify this to the public?
They couldn't justify it. They didn't even try.
I mean, how could you?
The sheer scale of the loss, compounded by the fact that the victims spanned international borders, British ships, American passengers, immigrants from across Europe, it forced a massive systemic response. The sinking essentially drew a hard line in history, forcing international governments to completely rewrite maritime law.
So, looking at the source material, what were the immediate shifts?
Yeah.
Let's start with the most glaring failure, the lifeboats and the tonnage laws.
The change there was immediate and uncompromising. The Board of Trade's outdated tonnage formulas were scrapped entirely for passenger vessels.
Good riddance.
Yeah. The new universal mandate was that every single ship must carry enough lifeboat capacity for absolutely every single person on board, passengers and crew.
That seems so incredibly obvious in hindsight.
It really does. This became the foundation for SOLAS, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, which still governs maritime safety today.
Make sure everyone has a seat before you leave the dock. It is a profound tragedy that it took the deaths of over 1,500 people to make basic math the global legal standard.
It is heartbreaking.
What else changed? Because the script mentions a massive overhaul in communications, right?
Right. So on the night of the sinking, there was another ship relatively nearby called the Californian.
Oh, I've heard of this.
They were close enough to see the distress rockets in the distance, but their sole radio operator had finished his shift and gone to bed. He had literally turned the wireless machine off.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
No.
they never received the frantic distress calls.
That is agonizing. Help was geographically close, but they literally just had their ears turned off because it was late.
So one of the immediate regulatory changes was the mandate that all passenger ships must maintain a 24-hour radio watch.
Makes total sense.
Ships were required to have multiple operators or automated alarm systems so that the airwaves were monitored constantly. A distress call would never again go unheard simply because the operator was asleep.
That is a massive leap forward, and the text highlights one more major international initiative regarding how ships navigate ice in the first place.
Yeah, the tragedy proved that relying on individual ships to spot icebergs using lookouts in the vast, dark Atlantic was fundamentally unsafe.
Right, because clearly that didn't work.
So an international coalition established the International Ice Patrol.
So instead of ships stumbling in the dark hoping to avoid ice,
Yeah,
there is a dedicated organization whose sole job is to track the hazard.
exactly. They monitor the presence of icebergs in the North Atlantic, originally using cutter ships and eventually aircraft and satellites, and they broadcast those locations to all maritime traffic.
Wow,
It created a centralized, proactive warning system. And remarkably, that patrol remains active to this day, funded by multiple nations.
This raises an important question, I think, about how human civilization progresses.
Oh.
We constantly talk about innovation,
Right.
Pushing boundaries, building bigger and faster machines. But so often, our safety frameworks only evolve reactively. We build the machine first and figure out the safety rules only after the machine breaks.
It is the unfortunate historical truth of human development. We are incredibly adept at inventing new technologies and pushing the limits of efficiency and luxury.
Absolutely.
But our institutional capacity to foresee the consequences of those innovations, to imagine the worst-case scenario and regulate for it, is frequently lacking. It almost always requires a catastrophic, undeniable loss to shatter the complacency of the operators and force the bureaucracy to update its legal frameworks.
It is a dark, heavy legacy. The passengers and crew who went down with that ship, their loss is a profound tragedy. But in a very real way, their deaths essentially purchased the safety of every single ocean traveler who came after them.
That's a very sobering thought, but it's true.
Pretty much every modern ship safety rule you can think of traces its origins directly back to the failures of that specific night in the freezing Atlantic.
Acknowledging that debt is how we ensure the lessons aren't forgotten. The Titanic isn't just a story about a ship sinking, it is the foundational text for modern risk management and maritime safety.
We have covered so much incredible ground today. We started this deep dive by immediately shattering the media-generated myth of the unsinkable ship,
Right.
exploring how public imagination, fueled by a trade magazine qualifier, dangerously oversold a genuine engineering innovation, and how corporate silence allowed that myth to flourish.
Then we examine the harsh reality of the engineering itself. The 16 watertight compartments that looked invincible on paper. We explored how the desire for first-class luxury capped the bulkheads at E-deck, allowing a 300-foot scrape to initiate the fatal ice cube tray cascading failure.
We confronted the horrifying bureaucratic reality of the tonnage-based safety rules, exploring how laws written for 19th century cargo ships mathematically doomed half the passengers before they ever left port.
Yeah, that math is just wild.
And we unpacked the psychology of the bridge crew, navigating the murky waters of hubris and the normalization of deviance, resulting in that perfect, tragic alignment of the Swiss cheese model of disaster.
And finally, we traced the sweeping international regulatory changes that followed, from mandatory lifeboat seating to the 24-hour radio watch and the creation of the International Ice Patrol, transforming maritime law forever.
It is a story that proves reality is vastly more complex and frankly vastly more interesting than the simplistic pop culture version we are usually fed. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I know you always have one last thought to leave us with.
I do.
Based on everything we've unpacked from this historical script, what is the lingering question you want our listeners to chew on?
Well, if you look at the core lesson of the Titanic, it is fundamentally a story about the sheer blinding pace of human engineering innovation, drastically outpacing the safety regulations of its era.
Right.
They built a 20th century marvel, but they regulated it with 19th century laws. So, my question for you, the listener, is this. Look around at the world today. What cutting-edge, rapidly scaling technologies are we currently building and deploying into society right now, while we are still quietly relying on the modern equivalent of tonnage-era safety rules?
Oh, wow. Are we moving at top speed through an ice field right now, just hoping the old math holds up? It's something to seriously think about the next time you hear a company announce a new technological breakthrough.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Our goal is always to help you strip away the myths, understand the mechanics of history, and get to the core of the information. Keep questioning the pop culture narratives. Remember that the reality of human error is rarely as clean as we want it to be. And as always, stay curious. We will see you next time.
That's it for today's episode of Whyloric. If this gave you a totally different picture of the Titanic than you had before, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. What's a historical disaster you think we've got completely wrong in pop culture? Until next time, stay curious. This has been Whyloric.